You are in Notes on Dangerous Game. Um, so who am I? I am a historian that went walkabouts and wandered into ICT security about 5 years ago by way of arms control and a number of other things. I recently have become an enthusiastic hoarder of old scene stuff, which is a little bit related to what we're going to talk about today, but not critical. I'm alleged to be a policy person, although that seems to be less and less the case these days. And also, just shout out to all of my friends at Black Hoodie Reverse Engineering Bootcamp. I am a sort of living pedagogical experiment. You know, can you teach a historian or a humanities person how to use computers? I live and work in sort of this environment most of the time. That is increasingly accurate. I think it felt funny the first time I made this joke about a year and a half ago, and now it just feels like accurate. And this, so this environment is part of the reason, or is part of the motivation behind this talk, right? You know, Notes on Dangerous Game is fundamentally a talk about attribution, why we do it, why we don't, how we do it, and what we can do better. And this is a really wide-ranging talk. I promise you that it could have been 3 or 4. Everybody is going to be disappointed in it as a consequence, including me. There are a lot of things that I wish I had been able to develop more fully, but I'll at least make reference to them. And there will be some GitHub repositories that go live later this week that contain a lot of raw material for people to look at. So that, just keep an eye out. So this is our to-do list. We'll hopefully get through most of it. And like I said, this could have been a number of talks. I really can't help being interdisciplinary, which means, all of you will walk out of here wishing I'd done more of something, less of something. And I will definitely, I will be highlighting the places where I wish I were able to show you more and talk less. In some cases, that's down to the fact that there are new findings that are under review, and while I can talk about them, I need to not get myself into too much trouble. Anyway, so 30,000 foot view, this is, we're gonna do pretentious titles, and I have 2 of them just for extra fun. And by way of an introduction, what are those? For those of you who can read the original, No Royal Road comes from Karl Marx and his introduction to the first French edition of Das Kapital from 1872. Basically, this is a really fancy way of saying hard things are hard, and there are no shortcuts. So there is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. Science, according to Marx, also included things like history. So basically, we're talking about contextual analysis. And that is something that is critically lacking from particularly the nation-state threat space. And our second pretentious title is Notes on Dangerous Game, which comes from Ernest Hemingway's third Tanganyika letter from 1934, which was published in Esquire. And one of my favorite quotes from that is, "In the ethics of shooting dangerous game is the premise that the trouble you shoot yourself into, you must be prepared to shoot yourself out of." And whether we're analyzing and attributing nation-state campaigns or taking potentially direct action against them, I feel like this is pretty sound advice. There's sometimes a little bit of over-eagerness or enthusiasm to do the shooting, both on the nation-state targeting their subjects of interest side and on the attribution side. So that's very nice like Hemingway, sort of a pithy Hemingway quote that basically urges caution. All right, so when we talk about nation-state malware and nation-state threats, we have a lot of sort of standard constructs that we default to. One of them I mentioned in my title is, the hunters in the game, and how we collectively think about nation-state adversaries and how those models fail us is where we're going to go with this. And so these are a couple of my favorite pictures or my favorite image results for threat hunting. And as constructs go, again, this captures both the idea of threat and also this hunter-game dynamic. And I do not know why the Allosaurus is wearing a hat. I also really can't explain that night vision business because the people pointing the guns clearly are not having any trouble seeing whoever's photographing them through those goggles. And that also captures the incoherence of some of our modeling. For better or worse, these are the sorts of things that shape our thinking about nation-state adversaries. And one of the things that I like about both of these ridiculous pictures is you get a sense of, sort of a disembodied threat. There's not a whole lot of context here. But if we're going to, indulge the hunter-game metaphor, we can at least dig into how this falls apart a little bit. So in a normal dynamic, hunters don't usually hold fire for the game to organize itself. And we're going to be liberally allocating and reallocating these designators. So in this case, if you are hunting nation-state threats, sometimes you might not necessarily withhold publication altogether, but give a friendly heads up to an intelligence agency that you found something and will be, pushing remediations for a thing that they have done. And I think when I wrote my submission for this talk, actually, a lot less had happened on this front than has happened in the last couple of months. Particularly, I think it was Kevin Mandia speaking at a Cyberscoop event that was the first sort of, I guess, real watershed in the question of whether or not attribution is, attribution and reporting on nation-state campaigns is really disinterested. And this is sort of I feel like this is almost a loss of innocence, because the idea that antivirus companies or threat intelligence firms are neutral has been, kind of a core principle of information security for, a long time. But this is a really excellent piece of reporting by Chris Bing. It's a very substantial piece, and one of the best quotes is about Microsoft, where they have privately notified U.S. government in the past, and these kinds of relationships exist all over the world. This is not just the United States. If you are reporting on nation-state campaigns, you have something along the lines of an obligation to perhaps the government of the country in which you are domiciled. How much that relationship influences your reporting has more to do with the legal regime of the state in which you are domiciled than it has to do with anything else. So what kind of pressure can a state apply to you does differ depending on where you are. And this is not a judgment. That is just a fact of legal regimes. So another excellent piece of reporting, just sort of demonstrates, Mandia characterizes US and China as the most restrained nation-state capabilities currently operating. And again, these are topics that I thought I was going to have to do a lot of legwork to, kind of show, okay, antivirus company A has substantial reporting that it was able to push on threat B that seemingly just appeared out of nowhere. It's very difficult to write 30, 40-page, in-depth technical documents in 48 hours. And you can map sort of delay, or you can find indicators of at least withholding behavior. I basically call it a no first use policy. And you can quite clearly map out the relationships between various vendors and various governments just by looking a little closely. Now, one thing that the characterization about US and China, particularly the US, as restrained, one response that usually triggers is but Stuxnet. And we will talk about that, but it sort of suffice to say, Mandia is not wrong. Just a very weird thing to say. So another way that adversarial constructs fail is, so the game sometimes will capture the hunter. And if you are at all familiar with the Citizen Lab at University of Toronto's Munk School, they have done years of excellent reporting on nation-state threats, particularly targeting human rights activists, such as this gentleman, who is Ahmad Mansour. He's an Emirati activist who has a truly spectacular, who has had a truly spectacular quantity of lawful interception and spyware platforms thrown at him. But he is also quite clueful and tends to push these on to analysts that can then produce lovely reporting on Finn Fisher, Hacking Team, most recently NSO. Now, despite the fact that Mansour had very good sense and very good technical support, I have to say this example is not a happy one. Because Mansour was sentenced, I believe, in May to a 10-year prison term for defaming the Emirates on social media. So as an aside, it's an interesting illustration of what happens when targeted collection or interception might fail, and the default that a state might move to, in this case, just frank censorship. And so in addition to hunters holding fire for the game sometimes capturing hunters, you have very strange behavior with respect to prey. They can be watched, so you might have an espionage activity. They can be played with, which I would refer to as active measures, or they can be mauled. And that would be sort of your destructive type attacks or interventions. And this may appear to be random, but it really never is. And one thing I want to emphasize is that the sophistication of an attack is not always reflective of the absolute technical capability of the actor executing the attack. So these are options in a toolkit. They are not strictly bounded by ability. All right, so story time. This was a fun exercise in trying to weave together the, not the real stories and the truther story, but the real story behind a number of malware campaigns and nation-state threats that most of you will have heard of. So just, I get audience participation, show of hands. How many people have heard of Stuxnet? How many people have heard of Duqu 2? Okay, still most people. Awesome. We're off to a good start. How many people know what this is? Okay. So this is a state portrait taken during the P5+1. So that's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council +1 negotiations over the what is called the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, that is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And how many people have heard of the JCPOA before? Okay, so because that's not a lot of people, a backstory is that Iran's nuclear program has been a problem for geopolitical stability for some time. There have been efforts to bring it under control, and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is, the TLDR is that it is the most consequential piece of arms control that has been executed in this century. So of the last 20 years plus, in terms of nuclear non-proliferation and global stability, the JCPOA is pretty much it. It's really quite important. And what it accomplished was it brought the Iranian nuclear program under the purview of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and kind of brought it out from the shadows and into inspectability. And that is super important when you have a country that is isolated and paranoid and attempting to develop nuclear weapons. So this is about Stuxnet, Duqu 2, Kaspersky AV, the JCPOA, and you. So negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran began in late 2009. And in early 2010, Israeli Unit 8200 took a questionable decision to update some implant code in a piece of kit that they had developed jointly with their US partners. This really annoyed the US, particularly when it started breaking a bunch of centrifuges at Natanz and then spread beyond the facility. And when I said earlier that we will get to the but Stuxnet part, this is the but Stuxnet part. And I get super annoyed that the differentiation or the refinement is not made, that Stuxnet was a joint Israeli-US operation, but the decision to deploy it in the manner in which it was deployed was a unilateral one taken by the Israeli partners. This is not secret. This is actually quite well documented, particularly in Kim Zetter's book. And I do not know why Stuxnet is always cast as an America fail specifically, but as like a bit of course correction, yeah, that was a case in which one partner said no and the other partner said YOLO, and that's and then a bunch of centrifuges started breaking. Now, if you don't know what happens when a centrifuge breaks, it's pretty awesome because these are metal canisters spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, and basically they can send something on the order of shrapnel if you manage to break the vacuum on one of these things, and they do fail regularly. Fast-moving machinery has fail rates. But when they fail in the numbers that they started failing in at Natanz, that's clearly, that is clearly a problem. Now, I have heard, and I used to subscribe, actually, this is me copying wrong thought. I used to think that Stuxnet was a net good, and that maybe the demonstration that it was possible to screw around with an enrichment facility, which in terms of actual danger is not high up there, but in terms of being impressive, Stuxnet had one true love. It was the facility at Natanz, and it was just overjoyed to be there once it got there. And the idea that Stuxnet may have helped propel the Iranians to the negotiating table, that this may have been stick that got them there, is something that I actually used to subscribe to, and it turns out that that is super wrong. And I think a lot of people in this community like to subscribe to that line of thinking because it's like the implant did its job, this was successful. But it turns out that that is not the case. So in early 2010, centrifuges start breaking, but keep in mind that negotiations had started in 2009. The events at Natanz precipitated a 14-month hiatus in the negotiation of, as I said, the most consequential piece of non-proliferation and arms control that has happened this century. So negotiations actually did not restart again until 2011. The consequence of Stuxnet was actually quite scary in retrospect, because if things had not gone the way they did, if the Iranians had not been able to come back to the negotiating table, we may not have gotten the JCPOA at all. And that's kind of scary if you're an arms control person, because that means that in this world today, this horribly and increasingly unstable world, we would still have an Iran working on its weapons program out of sight, not under scrutiny. So, you know, my revised assessment of whether or not Stuxnet was successful is, you know, very much no. Like that was not a great call on the part of the Israeli partners. Now, negotiations restarted in 2011. They did immediately deadlock. There was a fresh start in 2012, which went better despite the Israelis still protesting politically. There was an interim agreement on the nuclear program announced in January 2014, and that was when they announced further negotiations for Vienna, Geneva, and Lausanne. The Israelis were very much not invited, but they decided to hitch a ride via Kaspersky in the form of Duku 2 and listen in anyway. Again, we weren't super thrilled about this. In the middle of all of this, Crimea is annexed by Russia in March 2014. They shoot down MH17 in July 2014. There are utterly no consequences for this. And Kaspersky apparently manages to miss this Israeli intrusion via which they are spying on the JCPOA negotiations for about a year. Then they find out, they out the Israelis, and they publish on Duku 2 in June 2015. US are super annoyed with the Israelis again for snooping on negotiations that they were not invited to and making life super difficult again. Kaspersky was righteously indignant. The JCPOA was announced in July 2015 anyway. And let's see. So the plot twist here is that the Israelis passed intelligence from the Duku 2 operation that they executed to spy on the JCPOA negotiations to the US, showing pretty unneighborly hijinks by Russian intelligence services using Kaspersky products. The US was appreciative, but apparently unsure what to do. Relationship with the Israelis somewhat redeemed. Russia laughs quietly, proceeds to attack Ukrainian power distribution systems in 2015 with, you know, depending on your naming convention, Black Energy 2, 3, 4. And in the midst of all of this, the United States is suffering analysis paralysis as the shadow brokers threaten to dump stolen NSA wares. WikiLeaks is laundering stolen docs from Podesta and the DNC hacks. And we've got all manner of bears targeting the US presidential elections. And the point of this sort of integrated history is, you know, not to tell you that everything you know is wrong, not to, you know, not to scare you too much. But you can actually weave in the geopolitics to these nation state campaigns. And yeah, the tech is cool on its own. And no, you probably don't want this stuff lurking around your network. But the point of this is that this shouldn't be novel. You know, when we do analysis in, say, arms control, you will not find strictly technical papers about the capabilities of DPRK's Hwasong 15 ICBM that do not mention the paranoia of the North Korean regime, that do not mention the origins of their missile development program, that, you know, that do not properly contextualize the technology. And this is something that's fairly unique to information security. You know, we tend to aggressively ignore context. And, you know, this is not just a curio, this is actually a handicap. Because if you ignore that kind of geopolitical context, and again, this is security analysis. All of nation states leak information left, right, and center. And if you're not using that in determining how you are defending what you are defending, and making the determination of what might come for you when, you have a literally infinite universe of things that you might be defending against. And the point of contextual analysis is to winnow down the universe of the possible to what is probable. And if you combine that with sound technical analysis, then you're actually getting somewhere. But as I said, it is very rare to see that in this industry. Anyway, so we're going to move on to the postmortem and try to figure out what we can learn from kind of integrated contextualization. So nation-state threats exhibit observables beyond the strictly technical ones that we usually consider. It is not enough to look at IOCs or TTPs. You actually have to look at the behavior of states. For actually one example, and this was very recent, about a week, 10 days ago, a Swiss biotech firm was targeted quite aggressively, or reported that it had been targeted quite aggressively by Russian nation-state actors. And I was seeing tweets to the effect of, oh my God, this is like actual Tom Clancy, like, James Bond stuff. But we should have seen that coming a mile away, because about 28 days previously, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons had empowered itself to do attribution in chemical weapons attacks. And in the document that they adopted, they named the Novichok agent that was used in the Salisbury and Amesbury poisonings, and they basically indicated that they were going to be performing nation-state attribution on that attack. Because that was the Russians were really, really quite unhappy. So instead of being caught flat-footed and going, wow, I wonder why they're doing this, or who could have possibly foreseen that they would have been targeting a Swiss biotech firm that is implicated in doing chemical weapons attribution, that should have been really obvious. But again, if you're not doing the integrated analysis, you're not going to see that. So we talked earlier about vendor relationships to nation-state threats. They do demonstrate a lot more entanglement in autocracies than in democracies. And this is what I was getting at when I said the relationship between vendors and states is dependent on legal regimes. It is not contentious to say that recent updates to the Russian legal regime, particularly their anti-terrorism laws, have given them much more leverage over ICT security companies doing business, not just doing business, but those domiciled in Russia, than comparatively, say, the United States or an EU member state might have over ICT security companies domiciled in those jurisdictions. And by way of an example, the requirement now in Russia is that companies have to host their data there, and there are now 8 different agencies that can be required to, or that can have warrantless access to that data, basically at will. So as much as grumpy and as paranoid as we can get about the processes that we go through for lawful interception and access in the United States, it is much worse in other places. That's not an excuse, but it's important to keep in mind. And the point of this is just you kind of have to read the manual if you are dealing with a nation-state threat. And I have joked that you shouldn't have to know diplomatic history to do root cause analysis. That may not be true. And, you know, I certainly find a lot of benefit in particularly reading international law and the behavior of states there, but I have strange hobbies. Again, relative sophistication. This trips people up a lot. How many people remember Operation Ababil? Like one person. Okay, so how many people remember the DDoS attacks? Again, these were massive DDoS attacks against US banks in, I think, 2012. Yeah, okay, so that was Iran. that was called Operation Ababil. And I remember at the time that it was attributed as if this was, you know, script kiddie stuff. And it was like, oh, this is, you know, clearly this is not sophisticated. Actually, that is very clever. DDoS is a great way to inflict massive annoyance, but it is also a really fascinating way to divert money or deny funds. So traditionally, you can only do, like, if you're sanctioned, you can only do counter sanctions meaningfully if you're significantly entangled with the state that has sanctioned you. So it doesn't really do anything if Russia like threatens to sanction the US because there's not much entanglement and they're not very big. What's interesting about DDoS is this is a state that is able to do something like counter sanctioning with no entanglement whatsoever in a way that does not violate international law, like very clearly does not. And in a way that doesn't really break anything. It's just really expensive and irritating. So when we talk about sophistication, again, we're usually only talking about technical sophistication. In context, though, that was actually a really good campaign. That was very intelligent. You know, understanding the incentives for why a nation state may reach for something in the toolbox like that is going to be pretty important, particularly if you are defending something along the lines of critical infrastructure. Like these are very useful thought experiments to execute. Again, technical ability, not what determines a nation state's action on a target. I know it's fun to think that nation states just like, they have their hacking capability cranked to 11 all the time and you just let it run. But that isn't how it works. Now, if we recall some of the, you know, partner A says no, partner B says YOLO, the increase in a target value also pushes up risk appetite for the aggressor. And acceptable cost calculations. So if you're Israel and the objective is to, you know, keep Iran from developing normalized relationships with your closest and most powerful allies, it turns out your risk appetite is really high. Like high enough to do what they did with Stuxnet, high enough to piggyback on negotiations via a major AV. Like that's a lot of risk appetite, but apparently it was worth it to them. Now, the constraints on one of these campaigns are really not going to come, and I'm sorry, they are not going to come from your technical defenses. They are going to come from briefing rooms. So the sort of bad news and worse news is that if you want to talk about restraint or constraints on nation state adversaries, you really are talking about the normative behavior of states. And I get really grumpy about norms. Most people do. But they are pretty much the thing. And you know, you can in fact see this happening in international law. One example that's relevant to everyone here, interference, actually, catch myself, influence of the 2016 presidential election. Under international law, intervention and interference have specific meaning. They imply coercion, and they imply denial of sovereignty by force. Because the United States still had self-determination, and because this was influence, not intervention, it's not illegal under international law. In fact, international law doesn't even touch it. So again, you can see, like, if there had been outright manipulation of vote counts, that maybe would be crossing into dangerous territory. But if you're Russia, you actually don't want to you actually don't want to be caught violating international law. Like, you want to be legitimate. And you can see basically operational red lines not being crossed just by virtue of the fact that their risk appetite does not extend to being caught violating laws of armed conflict and actually executing intervention in a coercive way, unless there's already a shooting war going, in which case all bets are off. So this is also a form of signaling. And as we walked through the story of JCPOA, the popular narrative of Stuxnet as a signaling instrument, turns out to be wrong. But I think Dooku 2 is arguably a good example of that being signaling. That was communication of enormous risk appetite. It was also leveraging a jointly developed framework. But there's also, you can get into some like pretty gritty specifics. So Stuxnet, as designed, again, had one true love, which was Natanz. But if you flash forward to like Crash Override, there's a big difference between having a framework that targets specifically Siemens PLCs versus a framework that is generalizable to protocols that communicate with, in a vendor agnostic way with all of that kind of equipment. So in terms of what that says, I would say that there is much more threat implicit in, the latter example than there is in like the highly tailored, more specific example. And again, just signaling. And the last point is that, or last point in the postmortem is that it is really important to understand sponsor and affiliate agencies. Again, like I'm not putting like names of, I'm not putting names and headcount up on screen because I'm trying to keep myself out of trouble. But for example, the GRU is about 25,000 people. It's huge. But there's really good open source research on its organization, its budgets, its everything. Yes, you have to be able to read some Cyrillic, but it's totally worth it. And the objectives and the activities of those sponsor and affiliate agencies like GRU, Fancy Bear, APT28, the SVR is smaller, but it's still well over 10,000. And their crew, I think, is usually referred to as APT29 or Cozy Bear. And you cannot segregate the activities of the hacking crews from their affiliate agencies. It doesn't stop being GRU just because it's on the internet. And you do have to look sort of holistically at like, what other things does this agency do? What other relationships does it have? Where is it investing in capabilities development? And the GRU example is, it turns out GRU has a very specific personality. It's not particularly elegant. It's not particularly restrained. They are not subtle, and they are more than happy to use Novichok agents on UK soil, and they are also more than happy to continue using C2 even after it's been made, as long as it works, because why not? So to wrap up, we've got some applied learning. And this is something that got me really, really annoyed. So this was an analysis of Olympic Destroyer done by K-Labs, and I do respect their work quite a bit. But the argument was, it was sort of down a rabbit hole of how the rich header was here to trick the industry, and how if you can't trust rich headers, what can you trust? And nobody can ever do attribution ever again. And, all of this is sort of nonsense. And in this particular case, this is what happens when we become overly reliant on single indicators, or like you have your one true IOC, and an abysmal amount of automated threat classification is built on broken rich header parsers and broken extraction. So to back up, how many people are familiar with the rich header from in a portable executable? Few people? Okay, so this is something that is just in your executable binary. The TLDR is that it was undocumented for a really long time, and then it was, documented quite well. It is something that will, purports to give you sort of an import count. It gives you major and minor linker and compiler numbers. It's full of useful information if it's accurate. However, pretty much anything can corrupt it. So using packers, it can be forged. The MSVC6 linker can actually be patched to just straight up 0 rich headers so that you don't get any of this information. The idea that similarity in rich headers between two malware samples somehow undoes the ability to do attribution is, frankly ridiculous. And it's, I expect better from those researchers, and I hope that they do. Now, an interesting, serious plot twist in this entire exercise that just happened in the last sort of 10 days. This is a report called, so this is the shadow sector. How many people knew that North Korea actually has a digital economy and that it is international? Yeah, so I did not know that until this year. And I picked up this awesome report from the friendly folks at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And much to my horror, they detail things like biometric time attendance equipment being sold that contains DPRK origin tech being sold all over the world. Now, what was really fun about this is the good folks at Middlebury managed to find a healthy network of companies connected to a known DPRK front that has been sanctioned by the UN. But most of the companies that they found were China-based, or maybe Malaysia. By applying a slightly different methodology and actually chasing the USB drivers, I was able to find a US-based company that is selling the same equipment. And then also a Venezuelan one, and also more in Singapore, more in Malaysia. So what started as a network of between 4 to 5 companies is now looking more like a network of about 11 plus. And in terms of supply chain penetration, the issue of whether or not there is malware riding on this is almost irrelevant. I mean, this is, you should know if there is DPRK origin biometrics in your bank, in your chemical facility, in your, whatever you are defending. And just to wrap things up, this is my really, really strong recommendation if you do any kind of automated classification or analysis. Please do find this paper. This is the best academic and pretty much the best, most complete paper I've been able to find on the rich header and how to use that in malware analysis. One of the 4 talks that this talk could have been titled Responsible Use of Rich Headers, because that is one of the most broken parts of automated classification currently. And if you wonder why it is possible to have two functionally almost identical binaries that come up with wildly different threat scores on virus total or different profiles, a lot of it comes down to what changes to the binary actually do to the rich header, and sometimes it's just chance. A tiny change could have an impact on, the addition of one function might change the import count by a lot. And that in turn could change the rich header signature extracted by your analysis engine. There's about 5 minutes for questions, so please ask. The question is, how do you distinguish open source intelligence on nation state actors from disinformation on nation state actors? So nation states don't seem to spend that much effort on counterintelligence in open source. And it would be, at the end of the day, a state has to function as a state. So for example, I can imagine doing really great counterintelligence by falsifying, say, acquisition records. But then you've got false acquisition records that you're trying to run a government on, and it's not super practicable. I think there's one example I can think of where it's actually pretty easy to see that it's this information is usually when you have a state-run or state-sponsored news agency. Like if you look at TASS, which is one of the Russian news outlets, they're reporting on Russian developments in shiny new Russian arms, like the nuclear-powered nuclear cruise missile. Those usually are a little bit overwrought. And again, it's usually just down to context and common sense. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I just wanted to understand how, even if somebody goes through the process of figuring out the attribution and connecting it with the national or geopolitical landscape, how do you use that information to do what we need to do on a day-to-day basis? Have you seen the practical implications of it?
Yeah, so the question is, if you can do all of this attribution and contextual analysis successfully, how do you implement that on a day-to-day basis? And it really is down to, like I said, narrowing down the universe of the possible to the realm of the probable, and particularly in understanding red lines that your threat actors may have internally that you may not intuit from their behavior to date. If you can make assertions about the likely limits or the likely targets of interest, that helps you allocate resources more effectively. And everybody is resource constrained, so I feel like any movement that you can have in any positive movement is good in that direction. And I think probably going to take it to the wrap room. So
there's a wrap room in cell C's H. If everybody would like to ask more questions, you're welcome to. And thank you for coming.